Unbelievable. Look at that.
So it is 6:01 on Thursday, March 24th, and I'm gonna call this Lacey City Council work session to order. We have a published agenda. Are there any changes?
There's not.
Move to approve the agenda as published.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? And that motion unanimously carries. We have an agenda. First up on our agenda is the Puget Sound Energy Storm presentation. Can we bring Brandon on?
Hi, everyone. How's my audio?
Great.
Fantastic. All right, let me get my visual aid ready to go, and then we'll get started.
You can see it.
Hold on one second here. Perfect. You can see my home screen right now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right. All right, well, it's great to certainly see everyone today, and for the record, I just want to, say thank you for letting us join, and I know that this is, a timely update on storm communications. It's a little bit later on in the season, but I think that this will allow council to proactively respond to storm outages nonetheless. So for the record, my name is Brandon Capps, and I am the interim local government affairs and public policy representative for Puget Sound Energy, representing Thurston County. And again, want to thank you all for your time today. So some of the central themes that we'll be discussing today, so on our agenda items, we'll be starting with a safety moment. We'll be going over infrastructure and readiness, customer resources, how we restore power, things customers should know, COVID-19 impacts and implications, outage communications, and then lastly, we will round it out with a Q&A. Now, our safety moment is particularly relevant. Pertains to down power lines. So if any of you come across a downed utility wire of any kind, always do the following. Assume it's energized and stay as far away as you can. Call 911 or a central PSC office line. Do not drive over down power lines, and then whenever possible, stay in your car. And if you must evacuate, jump away and land with both of your feet together to ensure that you remain grounded and shuffle away to safety. And we have a host of great resources on our website. So new this year, we have the pse.com/storm landing page. And a lot of these include videos and on-site instructor-led classes in Tacoma and Georgetown, and also PSE restoration plans for a detailed description of systems prioritization, emergency response protocols, and these are all available to the general public, and I'm happy to provide that information after this presentation if needed. By way of background, PSE is Washington State's oldest and largest energy utility with a 6,000-mile service territory across 11 counties, serving over 1.1 million electric customers. Say that 5 times fast. So kind of demonstrating our commitment to safety is we have 900 plus employees with emergency response roles, and that actually consists of about 1/3 of our company's total employee profile. So again, just demonstrates that unwavering commitment to safety as a value, and ensuring that our customers have the resources that they need during a storm outage. Our ECCs communicate internally and externally in triaging repairs, and the Emergency Coordination Center also provides overall oversight and direction for a coordinated response effort. The following are the primary functions of the ECC, the first being situational awareness and common operating picture, the second being logistical support and coordination, and the third being communications support. And I want to caveat too that the ECC primarily opens when outages reach a threshold beyond what the company can manage under normal operations procedures. So think of outages in the thousands, which I mean commonly does happen, unfortunately, during the throes of storm season. Now, there's also a very helpful link on how we restore power on YouTube that I'm happy to provide following this presentation. But just to give kind of a general idea of how PSE prioritizes systems prioritization, we typically look at it in 3 tiers. So we have transmission systems being number 1, and they connect at the regional level and also are how we get power from critical generation assets like dams, power plants, wind farms to customers at the county, city, and neighborhood level. And they also have regional implications and affect other utilities, as I'm sure many of you know. Then we have substations. Substation outages affect thousands of customers at a time, and it's critical to re-energize our substations prior to the next level of power distribution. And then really what's probably at the front of most of your minds is distribution systems. So these are the systems that deliver to your home or your business, and really what you see, day to day, driving to and from work, driving to the grocery store, and so forth. So we follow a similar trajectory here on customer priority. Within the above context, PSE considers additional priority restoration, and our emergency response coordinators maintain lists of critical infrastructure by service territory, and Lacey is no exception. So think of hospitals, regional airports, water and wastewater treatment plants and sewage facilities, emergency shelters, and facilities from which folks can't be easily relocated. So what really immediately comes to mind is nursing homes and assisted living facilities and the like. At any one juncture in time when we're dealing with a storm communications outage, you're typically going to see 3 types of trucks. So you'll see a PSE damage assessment vehicle, a PSE electrical first response vehicle, and then a Patelco line worker vehicle. Now, it's important to caveat that PSE has an obligation to clear arterial rights of way even before restoring power, and that may require several different visits. And so if you see a PSE truck leave and there's still no power and the area hasn't been energized, there's likely one of 3 scenarios or more than one taking place. So that could be a piece of equipment needs repair and a line worker and crew are needed, so an entirely different vehicle. The outage may just take extra time, or they're maintaining that obligation to clear that arterial right of way to allow for ingress and egress and make sure that there are no obstructions or additional hazards in the immediate vicinity. And for most outages, PSE doesn't know when an outage occurs unless we're notified by our customers. And this is particularly relevant on distribution lines. And that's why I this is being front of mind for most of our customers, because distribution lines, unlike substations and transmission lines, are not monitored in the same way as substations and transmission lines are from a load office. So really soliciting the input of our ratepayers and our customers is critical to ensure that we can get them re-energized in a timely fashion. So there's a few key points as well here that I'd like to point out. So just in the last 5 years, I would say that PSE's made some pretty significant inroads on kind of streamlining our digital presence and allowing residents and affected customers to track in real time developments that are occurring on our storm communications. So we have our mobile app that's now available, which I'm really a big fan of. And then you can also track these things called ETRs. So that's a based average on your estimated time of restoration. Typically, it will outline cause if it's known, and it will also know if we have dispatched crews to the area or what stage of development we're really looking at for this particular outage. You can also track PSE on Twitter, Facebook, and Vimeo for more visual aids and developments of pictures. And in addition, we send situational reports to local and county EOCs when our ECC is activated. So the Emergency Coordination Center, when we really have those larger outages, is when you'll see that relationship develop. And so overall, it's just really a fantastic resource for our customers in the event that they want real-time updates. And so also I can provide a link for this as well, but I think it's always good to remind folks to just create an emergency kit to keep around you and your family. Keep your family comfortable for at least 3 days with a few key resources. And if you have pets too, it's important to keep your animals in mind. But that's really one of the variables that's in our control to proactively respond to these outages. And so, again, happy to provide a link to help develop that kit if it's of interest to council. And then lastly, I believe that I'm saying this, but we're entering year 2 of a global pandemic that was largely unprecedented. And while this presented tremendous challenges and hardships for our customers, I think that PSE demonstrated that they're equal to the task, and we've done what we can to maintain energy security on their behalf. And so I think this is really demonstrated in 2020 when we created the COVID bill assistance program to assist residential customers facing financial hardship due to the pandemic. And if you qualify, we'll credit your account for past due balances up to $2,500 per program year. And since March of 2022, PSE's COVID bill assistance fund has helped 4,878 Thurston County customers alone access a total of $3.6 million in bill assistance. And what I find particularly encouraging about this number here is that just in early November of 2021, we were seeing probably 1,000 customers less in Thurston County that had received assistance through this program. So it's good to see that they're still being engaged, and we're still reaching those communities that are at risk and providing them with the best resources that we possibly can. And then for those who don't qualify for the bill assistance program, there's several other identified options, such as extended bill repayment plans to ensure energy security. And as always, if you do know of a perfect example with your constituency, please reach out to any of us, and we're happy to facilitate that discussion and do whatever we can to help rectify the issue. And with that being said, happy to open it up for questions.
Any questions? I guess the big question is, how is the storm season compared to past storm seasons? Doesn't seem like it's been quite as bad.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that particularly in Kitsap County, it was especially rough. County was spared some significant damage this year. So fingers crossed that continues to next year as well.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
This isn't directly relevant to the presentation you gave, which is focused on storms, but has PSE done some analysis of how they'll respond if we have a large earthquake? Because some of our lines are above ground, some of them are below, and it's a little different than a storm.
Yeah, I mean, it's technically not fully in my wheelhouse. I'm happy to defer to some of our engineers internally. I know that we've been part of numerous exercises to protect critical infrastructure from seismic events, but to lend to the specifics on how we've hardened that infrastructure, I would like to circle back with you just to make sure that I can give you the best possible answer.
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Brandon.
Thanks, everyone.
So next up on our agenda, Bill, see you.
Yeah, good to be here. I think it's been about 3 years since I've been back in here in this area. Called up on PowerPoint, I think. Yeah. Find the controls for that. Not popping up here. Maria, hey, see screen share.
On the bottom of the Zoom.
Which is
I'm gonna take over.
there you go.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm taking hold of this, thanks. All right. I'm Bill Adamson. I'm the program director for South Sound Military and Communities Partnership. I have been with the organization a little over 6 years, and joining me today on Zoom is Maria Tobin, who's our program coordinator. She joined us in May of this past year. So many of you are familiar with some of the stuff I'm going to talk to, especially if you've been around for the last 4 or 5 years. If you're newer than that, some of this will be new to you. So I apologize for some of the repetition, but there is quite a bit of new stuff in here. First thing I want to point out on this opening slide is bottom right-hand corner, we have an icon for the city of Olympia. They've been a member of SSMCP for years at the general membership level, which is a $500 annual membership fee. But this year they've jumped up to the working group co-chair level. They're going to be involved with our social services working group and maybe some other stuff as well. That's still being worked out. So they're now giving us $2,500 a year. And then over here on the far left lower, you see an odd icon called Operation Red Dot. That's a real estate firm that has joined us at the working group level. And we're going to be forming a new housing task force. I'll be talking about this tomorrow with our steering committee, but we are going to be forming a housing task force and they're going to be part of that lead effort. Get asked a lot, what's the value of membership with SSMCP? I try to capture it here. Some of the big takeaways from this slide is at the very bottom, it's kind of covered up by this, the text that's flying through here. But we did in 2019 a stakeholder survey. Almost all of our membership, and then plus some others that have been involved with us over the years. And 54% of them rated our advocacy, legislative advocacy work as the most valuable thing that we do, because we now are developing a shared regional legislative agenda. I'll be talking to that a bit later. We've been very successful over the last several years. Some big wins this last legislative session as well. And that's the one thing that when this organization was formed back in 2011, they didn't do any legislative advocacy until about 2016. When a certain program director came on board. I'm here to give you an update on a 15-month process that we've been going through to update the growth coordination plan. Back in the 2007-2008 timeframe, when the Iraq and Afghanistan war were really cranking heavy, the Department of Defense decided they wanted to try a new joint basing concept. This is the outcome of a 2005 BRAC study. BRAC is Base Realignment and Closure Commission. It was one of the main recommendations is to start joint basing, they thought, as a cost-saving measure. But before joint basing could be implemented here at McChord Air Force Base in Fort Lewis, Washington, the Department of Defense funded a grant, a growth coordination plan that was published in 2010. And that became the foundational document for forming the South Sound Military and Communities Partnership and for forming Joint Base Lewis McChord. So Joint Base Lewis McChord stood up in October of 2010. And the SSMCP stood up 6 months later. So we've been operating off of that decade-old plan now, and now we've just updated it, and it's going to be published next week on the 31st of March. So then it'll be ready for public consumption, and I'll tell you a bit about it. The mission statement, as we developed it, is there in that light green box. And then the 3 key tasks are assess the continued relevance of the old strategies and priorities from 2010. Based on that assessment, provide an updated growth coordination plan for 2022. And the bottom one that's covered up is recommend a new work plan for the SSMCP. So this is the way we sort of organized for I should have said, I'm sorry. Sometimes I float back into military jargon. I was in the Army for 30 years and I have a tendency to do that. But this is how we organize the plan. We're now at the very last segment of it, with the key deliverable being the SSMCP 2023-24 work plan. Now, our consultant team isn't giving us a final version. They're giving us their recommendation, and we're going to take it through a process that we've been using for years now to finally get it approved in September at our steering committee retreat, and then we take it to our elected officials council in November. So the old 2010 growth coordination plan was organized around 11 core resource areas. You see them in the green box there. We took a look at those 11 about 8 months ago and decided that public utilities, infrastructure, public safety, and quality of life were not direct missions of our partnership. Our jurisdictions that are part of our partnership have big roles in those areas, but the way SSMCP is currently organized, we don't really play a heavy role in public utilities, public safety, or quality of life really permeates everything, so we didn't have a separate resource area for that. Underpinning this effort is the recognition that Joint Base Lewis McChord is absolutely critical to this region's economic health. So as we enter into the last phase of this project, we came up with a strategy summary matrix. I'm only going to show you 2 slides. It's going to be about 6 or 7 of these strategies. There's 26 strategies. I wasn't going to bore you with all of them, but I just want to tell you how this will be used when you can access this on our website. So the resource area obviously is listed down the left-hand side. In the strategy is the actual verbiage that we're accepting. Top one has 100%. And what that 100% means is back in November, we did a polling session with our steering committee members and work group chairs. 100% of them voted that this was the #1 issue, off and on base housing. Number 2 was occupation licensure portability. We had several initiatives like that work in this session. We had a couple wins on that, but almost 93% voted for that one. Transportation, which has been the #1 thing for the last 6 years that I've been here, still very high, but it's down at number 3 at 92.3%. And in the far right column, you can see what we think the role for SSMCP is. Some of these are support roles, some of these are a lead role. And when we're usually in a support function, we're doing information sharing, networking, working with the organization that has the lead. We do a lot of legislative advocacy when we are in support of something else. We do a lot of legislative advocacy when we're in the lead for something. So these were the top 3 that came out of the polling session last fall. Just to follow up, we got a new one here with climate change. As it relates to resiliency planning efforts, we need to do a better job of that. We haven't even been working with climate change as an organization for the last 10 years. In economics, this last in 2020, and we basically used pre-COVID numbers. We published a JBLM regional economic impact analysis that got a lot of traction. I'll talk a bit about that tonight as well. But 77% essentially voted that into the number 5 spot, and then 2 land use ones, both of which are still related to housing. The first one is JBLM developing more on-base housing. I'm going to talk about a problem they have with that. And then support service members in obtaining off-base housing. So this is how you use the summary matrix. Like I said, there's 26 total strategies, but that's what comes out of these strategies is the recommended draft work plan. And so we've listed these. These are not in necessarily priority order, but the first 3 are. There's your on and off base housing, your occupation, so licensure, your I-5 corridor improvements, which I'm going to talk in detail about. And then working our way down to a new one. Food insecurity as an element of financial readiness and literacy. I really have been tracking this maybe more in Pierce County than I have in Thurston County, but it seems to be a growing problem. We don't have validated data on it yet. We have a lot of stories, anecdotal stories of what's going on. And we are working with Congresswoman Strickland's staff on this. This one is near and dear to her. They don't have the data they want yet either. We're picking up a new partner to work with us on this, and that's Amazon. They have a global military affairs division. They're going to be working with us on this food insecurity. I'll tell you that the installation leadership look at this as more of a financial readiness or financial literacy issue than they do a food insecurity one. But Amazon just got us a study from Syracuse University that looked at the entire nation and all the installations. And it's a growing problem. And it basically comes down to, especially the lower enlisted with families who are forced to live off base, because by DoD policy, 70% of the military force must live off base. The folks that live off base use all their basic allowance and housing up. The folks that live on base use their basic allowance and housing for on-base housing, but it includes all those utilities. So the folks that are living off base have more bills than the folks that are living on base, just by luck of the draw. And some of those families that are out there need help getting food. So we got to confirm a lot of this, but that's the way it's looking right now. And then that bottom one is also new. I mentioned that one earlier. We're going to be working with JBLM on an installation resiliency plan. They've started some work on that in the energy and water sort of realm, but none of that work that they're doing extends outside the fence line of the installation. And we will be doing that. And then a good example of that might be something like this. If because of sea level rise, climate change, stormwater buildup, for some reason I-5 gets overtopped by a flood and it shuts down the whole western corridor of the United States because of that, that could be a resiliency issue. If sea level rise comes into the Port of Tacoma and it floods the US oil and refining location where all the aviation fuel is produced for the C-17s and the helicopters on base, that could become a national security issue. So we're going to take a look at some of these other scenarios like that. This is just a heat map that shows where all the active duty service members live. Obviously, the kind of dark blue or black one in the middle is Joint Base Lewis McChord. They have almost 7,600 barracks on base, and they have 5,159 family housing units on base. But look at Lacey, in the kind of the darker blue area. That's the outside of Joint Base Lewis McChord. That's the heaviest populated area of active duty military. And that workforce has to go up I-5 every day over the Nisqually River. So I mentioned earlier an economic impact analysis we did in 2020. At the same time, we did a business leader survey. Some of this seems like it's 2 years old, but we haven't really been able to pitch it because of COVID. So here we are, and the data is still very relevant, and we'll be doing an update to this in about a year. So most of the respondents actually came from Thurston County. Many of them, over half, had a current or past affiliation with the military or Joint Base Lewis McChord. And you can see the business type there in the pie chart. Many independently owned smaller businesses answered this survey. So out of the survey, I'll explain the bar graph first. So all respondents are in the blue. The sort of peach color are just business leaders, and the gray bar is business leaders with no military affiliation in the past. And we asked them a question, how much is JBLM's economic impact? And that's how the answers broke out. So over 85% of them thought the economic impact was less than $10 billion. When in actuality, statewide, it's $13.9 billion. The same business owners were asked about what percentage of their business can they attribute to the presence of JBLM. And 80% of them said that less than 20% of their business could be attributed to JBLM. I would argue that many of those service members that are living off base are spending their money in those local businesses. So the big takeaway from the economic impact analysis is on this chart. Over 92,000 jobs statewide. Of those 92,000, over 83,500 in Pierce and Thurston County alone. Salaries approaching $9 billion. Gross impact across the state, almost 14 billion, 12.1 in Pierce and Thurston alone, and some significant tax revenue for local and federal sources. All this chart really tells us is that military installations the size of JBLM are economic drivers for a region. One thing I wanted to highlight in the big blue box at the bottom, simply because of the presence of JBLM, it's 35,000 additional off-base civilian jobs in the state. Of those, 25,500 are here in the South Sound, reading Pierce and Thurston County. So these aren't, you know, these are your car dealerships, your mechanics, your dry cleaners, your restaurants, stuff like that are here because you got to support an additional city of, if you include all the dependents on JBLM, you're about 120,000 folks that are involved with the base. So we've been trying to figure out a better way to communicate this economic impact message. And so this is a new chart, so I'm trying it out with you tonight. So the red numbers are dollars, economic impact. The blue numbers are employment, jobs. But the reason this got to be scaled like this, because dollar numbers are actually in 100K increments. So at the bottom one there, the labels are covered by that thing, but the 13,000 number translates to 1.3 billion, and that's Pierce tourism. The $1.4 billion is commercial fishing statewide. The $8.3 billion is the entire state's wine industry. The next one is $13.9 billion, which is JBLM. One after that is the state biotech industry, which comes in at $15.5 billion. And the last one is the University of Washington, and its contribution to state economy is $15.7 billion. They also have a big number for employment there, 100,520. I'll just tell you that includes the student body and part-time jobs as well. The number for JBLM is all full-time equivalent jobs.
So do you want questions as you go, or you want them at the end?
No, it's fine. I'm on your schedule.
Good.
Just curious, and it's probably a slide or two ago, but you said that the business leaders that you spoke to that were surveyed, they all underestimated, it sounded like, what the impact is. They all thought it was less than 10 billion.
Right. So I had a team of 4 graduate students, an economics professor, and the chair for the Center for Business Analytics at UW-Tacoma work this analytic problem for us. And they said that percentage is a statistically significant finding. Because it's when you say that, there's a causal relationship between why they choose 85% of them choose wrong. They just don't understand the impact of it. And I and others like me need to be able to better communicate this to the public.
Absolutely. It's odd to me that business leaders don't realize how much of their business is because of them. I mean, you just look around here locally here in Lacey. I mean, half these restaurants don't have a reason to be here if you don't have the additional population from the
There you
base
go.
and the barber shops and so on and so forth, you know, I mean.
But, I think in Lacey in particular, we see more people in active duty, wearing their active duty uniforms, but you're not seeing the wives and the children's. And so as the business owner, you're not seeing.
Sure, but you
So they're
still,
trying population wise, they're just not putting.
you're not seeing it as directly, because it's not in uniform, I get that, but as a business owner, and
I know.
you know that your Lacey Car Wash, there's a high percentage of people coming there who are either active duty or the families of active duty. It just makes sense because they live there.
There's really not a good way for a businessman, unless he's offering military discounts or something, to be able to track that. Maybe they don't have a reason to track it. This is another attempt we took at trying to tell this story differently, and I got some help from Gene Angel, who works at the Thurston Economic Development Council on this one. But what we did was looked at some comparison of some economic output numbers for different industries for Thurston and Pierce County combined, is what we were looking at. And so JBLM's impact is bigger than the entire construction industry of Pierce and Thurston County. It's bigger than finance and insurance. It's bigger than wholesale trade and it's bigger than retail trade. And the big one here was real estate. And you can imagine with the real estate market, it's up there close to 14 billion. Those numbers for JBLM are direct impact. There's also induced and indirect that gets us to those higher values. But that's direct, which is basically the salaries of the service members that come in. And then this thing called economic multipliers. Gene explained this to me. For every dollar that's spent here in the area, JBLM generates $1.52 of value. So another way of just describing the importance to our region. So I'm going to start shifting gears here. I just wanted to show you we've had quite a bit of legislative success getting money. The big one here under state funding success with the blue plus 75 million is the money we just got about a week and a half ago from the state legislature for the I-5 Nisqually Delta project. But over the years here, you can see that $835 million in advocacy efforts, $250 million from the feds. Those dollars are flowing into Washington State because of JBLM's presence and SSMCP's collaboration with the communities around here. So that's the big takeaway. And you can see some more transportation money there. And that number for 20.7 is going to go way up after our next project gets started here. So on our legislative agenda this past session, we had three things. The Nisqually Delta or I-5 Nisqually Delta project, mentioned the 75 million. I have a transportation working group meeting on Monday with WashDOT. And we're going to talk about how we're going to spend that $75 million. The money's not ours. They always give the money to WashDOT for some reason. And they're going to do the project. We had something called the Defense Community Compatibility Account or DCCA program. That did not pass and we will continue to advocate for that. And lastly, occupational licensing improvements. We got 2 wins out of this one. One is a compact for occupational therapists. The others have to do with psychology, and it's an interjurisdictional compact with several states. So basically what those do is if you're a professional, licensed professional in one of these areas, and say this is for everybody, but say you're in the military. If your husband or wife is stationed in Virginia and now you're moving to Washington State, you can bring your license with you and start working within the first 30 days and do whatever you need to do to get it updated for Washington State. But that's not going to hold you up from being employed and starting to make money at a very delicate time when somebody transitions. Moving is one of the toughest things you got to do, especially if you have kids that are getting displaced from all their friends and their family. It's just tough. And then if the spouse can't work, it's a hit on you.
Do you know what types of professions that relates to specifically?
Well, there has been one for MDs, physical therapists. Nurses didn't make it. The nurses union fought that one. And 2 years ago, that one didn't get through.
Really?
Now these two. And then the one that didn't pass that you can't see is the one we're going to advocate heavily for, is the Military Spouse Employment Act. It didn't quite make it through the full session. It was championed or sponsored by Representative Mari Levitt from 28th District up in Lakewood area. So we're going to try to help her get that one started up next session, because that would help all military spouses for all kinds of professions. Childcare providers, teachers. I mean, we're in short supply of these things. So if you're a teacher in Texas and you come here, your teaching license is not valid until you go through whatever procedure you got to go through.
Mike, you got a question?
Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on how important that House Bill 1592 is, because you need multiple incomes per household to afford to live here. So that's a huge thing, not getting that passed. So I don't understand it.
It's a benefit to employers too. Like you say, there are specific professions that we don't have enough people in those professions, like nursing, like teaching. And so speeding up, getting people into those roles.
That's what this is
benefits
all
us.
about.
Yeah.
So we'll try again.
Why would the nurses union have been opposed to that?
I know. So every state has different requirements for nursing. Some states have considerably less requirements to be a nurse. And so in some cases, you're bringing less qualified people into a position where they get the same pay as these nurses who have gone through all these other stuff. And so the union said, no, hey, that's not fair.
Okay, it makes sense. My daughter's a nurse and her husband's military and they've moved several times. And
Yeah.
it
But
is,
what they
it's a
should do-
process every time they
Yeah,
move.
but what they should
for to
do
get
is
licensed in that
say,
state.
they should recognize that and then give them the opportunity to catch up on that. You know,
Yeah, there's gotta be a better way.
there's gotta be a better way.
We have a huge shortage of nurses.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to shift focus now to the I-5 Nisqually Delta project. So if you have any other questions on the stuff I already went over, you can ask now or wait till the end, but it's going to be road work here and advocacy briefing. So we started a heavy advocacy effort for this project back in 2017. We knew after the 2014-15 $495 million project up by the JBLM corridor, that was just going to move a lot of traffic to the south into Thurston County. So we started working this. We initially asked in 2017 for $2 million. State legislature only gave us $500K. But due to additional contributions from WashDOT, TRPC, and the Nisqually Indian Tribe, we drove that up to $2 million. WashDOT was able to produce something called the corridor study. And the Indian Tribe was able to contract with US Geologic Survey to do a hydrology study of the Nisqually River and the Nisqually Delta, which is complete now. With that, we went back to the legislature in 2019 and got 2.25 million to do something called a PEL report, a Planning Environmental Linkages report. This is something, again, that WashDOT does. WashDOT has completed that now. They're going to sign it next week. At this transportation working group meeting, we're going to talk about that before it's actually signed. At the same time, the money that the Indian Tribe contributed, we got $300K for the USGS study. And they worked that through 21. Last session, we got $5 million for the NEPA study. And NEPA study is the selection board for the consultant contractor is about to meet the submissions. The RFPs have been submitted and WashDOT's running a selection board. And if you know Mark Daly from TRPC, he's a member of that selection board. Great to have him on there. That NEPA study will produce what's in the yellow box at the bottom. It's hard for you to see. But the big thing it's going to produce is a conceptual alternative to the way I-5 is currently constructed over the bridge through those railroad trestles that are actually in Pierce County. Out of this PEL report, WashDOT recommended creating sections or segments off of this 17-mile stretch that we call Mounts Road, exit 116 by the golf course there in Pierce County, all the way down to exit 99 in Tumwater. And the section that we're most concerned about is 116 Mounts Road to 111 Marvin Road. That's the section where the Delta, the river, the railroad trestles, the bridge, everything is there. So NEPA is going to take about 3 years. So we anticipate it'll be complete in 2025. And then we'll know what alternative we're going to go for. And we'll know pretty well how much it's going to cost. And that's about the point. We need to start heavy lobbying for federal money. Because once we know what we need to build and we know generally what the cost is going to be, we can hit up for the federal dollars at that point. And the very best case scenario that we can think about, we could start construction out there in 5 years. This is lightning speed for some of this. Some of this transportation stuff works at like ice age paces, but this is like lightning speed in best case scenario. Of that 75 million that we got, we're still talking about it, but 19 million was originally going to be devoted to 3 roundabouts off of SR 507 out by Elm, and 6 million of it was going to be for right-of-way purchases along the I-5 section there. And then the remaining 50 million, which we asked for 125, we got 75. The remaining 50 million is what's going to produce the pre-design, essentially. the cost estimate for this project. And then you see the construction blurb out there. So now I'm going to tell you why this is so important. That corridor study told WashDOT to come up with a strategic plan for the Nisqually River bridges. Then the legislature gave us that $2.25 million. We wanted to look at mid and long-term environmental impacts. At the same time, we had the USGS working the hydrology study. To us at SSMCP, this is important for all those things with green check marks on them. This is a multifunctional project. It's not just a transportation project, but the big one for SSMCP is military readiness and national security. What happened in December 2017? A train derailed at exit 116. It blocked the highway. A third of the JBLM workforce couldn't report for duty, creating a national security crisis. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you where USGS predicts much longer interruptions on I-5 caused by flooding. So TRPC did some modeling.
Mayor.
And this was part of the corridor study. The modeling shows a pretty severe backup here. So we're starting in the lower left-hand corner where it says exit 116. That's kind of where the golf course is and right around where the train derailed. That's where it's going to go from 5 lanes in Pierce County down to 3 lanes, because you got to get through those train trestles. When that happens, it causes a backup. This model was run at a typical 6 in the evening on a work day. That red line is really a series of red dots. You can see them in different places, but it's so packed, so congested, it's gridlock from 116 to 125, which is Bridgeport in Lakewood. You can imagine how long it's going to take to get through this. And this is without an accident. This was without a car breakdown. This is everyday southbound. Northbound, it's not a problem because we're going from 3 lanes to 4 lanes. So northbound's not too much of a problem. It used to be a problem, but now so many people are working from home, it looks like it's going northbound is not as big a problem. This kind of problem isn't only here, but it's also at the 101 I-5 interchange. Very similar backup type thing going on. But for us, for me and SSMCP, it's this segment from Marvin Road to Mounts Road that's our priority right now, because it's a national security issue if those guys can't get to work. So on the left is the cover of the WashDOT corridor report, and it said this: all recommendations from this study should be considered provisional until the Nisqually Indian Tribe USGS study is completed. On the right is the boundary of that study, shows the area by the bridges that was looked at by USGS. I've had this slide since about 2018. I got it from the Nisqually tribe, but it really shows the progression over about 6 or 7 decades of how the Nisqually River used to be straight, and now it's got a huge oxbow in it. And that oxbow, if you can read at the bottom, at current rates, channel migration, the riverbank may undercut I-5 by 2040, 2055. So once it undercuts I-5 is no longer viable.
And that projection is minus a really dramatic storm, right?
Yeah,
This is just normal.
this
weather.
is just normal evolution of the river. So here's one of the key findings out of the hydrology study. It confirms that I-5 causeway and existing bridges are at risk of flooding, are not climate change resilient, and impact the functions and processes that form and maintain habitat for important fish and wildlife species. And these species, especially Chinook, are like spiritual to the Nisqually Indian tribe. And they are a key partner on this whole project, is the Nisqually Indian tribe. The other key finding out of the USGS report, and I'll explain this coastal squeeze thing here in a minute if you haven't seen it. So they ran the models for the 10-year flood and the 25-year flood. One of those floods was what happened in Chehalis in 1996. So something like that now happening by the Nisqually Delta with the suspected or projected sea level rise due to climate change. What we got here in the coastal squeezes, there's more rain, there's less snow, there's less snowpack, there's higher groundwater tables, there's storm surge, there's wave energy, all this stuff happening together at the delta. It's going to cause this thing called coastal squeeze. And the coastal squeeze leads to constrictions imposed by the I-5 corridor that lead to water levels over land that will challenge flood management, human safety, transportation, and recent investment in ecosystem restoration. So it's a big deal. Now, it's going to cost a lot of money to fix it. And here's what the model, the Chehalis type flood model, which could be considered a 100-year flood type thing. The other thing that came out of this report is what has typically been called or traditionally been called the 100-year flood will now occur every 22 to 23 years. So you're going to get much larger flood events now on a more frequent basis, according to the USGS. And on their model, I-5's overtopped in 4 different locations, all of them cutting off the bridge. So in summary, what this plan will do, will replace the 2 river bridges, the northbound and the southbound bridge. We'll look at those BNSF and South Transit Railroad trestles to figure out a way to get around those. We'll widen the road from 3 to 4 lanes, and it will address the critical ecologic functions for salmon survival. So that's a big project. Been working that one for almost 7 years now. This Pell report that I mentioned earlier, Planning Environmental Linkage Report, is out for public comment right now. The comment period ends on Monday, the 28th of March. The link, if you want to look at it, the more the merrier, submit comments on this thing, because it's very important to us. Steve Rourke is the relatively new regional administrator for Olympic Region. He had been there previously as the deputy to John Winans. Steve is now the administrator. We're going to meet with him in about 2 weeks. Talk to him about how to fix the issues that are out there. Once again, this is probably the biggest project in this region when you get talking to big numbers coming in. So the path forward, one of the things we want our partners to do is how can we be more helpful to what WashDOT has to do to take on this project? We're going to talk to Steve and others about how do we want to spend this 75 million? How does WashDOT get to spend our money that we got for them? And what are the federal sources that are available and on what timeline? In talking with Congresswoman Strickland earlier this week, we found out that she's under the impression that in order to get federal dollars, the project has to be listed on what's called the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program. It wasn't previously. Maybe with the $75 million, it's going to be listed, but we got to go through whatever process it is to get it listed on the TIP so that we can compete for federal money. There you go.
Yeah, and you'll go on to the tip through the Thurston Regional Planning Council. WashDOT will put it on the tip, and then the TRPC will have to approve it. And that's how it'll go on the tip. But the big,
Well, could I have one question?
sure.
You already know this answer. But a difficult engineering problem for this project is actually in Pierce County and PSRC,
Mhm.
the 2 railroad trestles and half the bridge.
Yeah.
Do they have to pick it up on theirs too?
Yes. So PSRC is going to have to do their part and put it on their tip, and TRPC is going to have to put it on.
That's
their
going to
tip.
take a heavy advocacy.
Yeah, that's going to be harder actually than the TRPCs, because PSRC doesn't think anything exists south of Tacoma. So it's going to be a big deal. The other big worry here is there's a ton of federal funds through this new, what they're calling the bill, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that was passed. And it's generational dollars, dollars that can go to this project. The problem is there's going to have to be a match. And so what we'll have to do is figure out what the overall cost is. And we're talking about as much as $1 billion to do this. And then we have to come up, the state's going to have to come up with a match. And so we're going to have to go back to the state and get them to come up with a match so we can apply for the federal funds. So there's a lot of work to be done here. Anyone, do you have any questions?
You mentioned right at the start of your talk that you all are forming a housing task force.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, what your objectives are?
Sure. Well, we had a housing task force back in 2019, 2020, because we did a housing study back then. It was focused on off-base housing for lower enlisted. We got a lot of good numbers out of that thing. On base, the garrison command, the base commander is using our study to try to justify building up to 300 or 400 new on-base housing units. But at the same time that we did our local study, Department of Defense funded a nationwide housing market analysis. And this team is called Robert D. Niehaus Incorporated. They came in, looked at our region, and they came back with completely different results than we did. They said there's a decreasing need for housing. By 2025, they'd only need 245 more military housing units. Where we're talking about, we have severe housing shortages just with population growth. We're gonna need tens of thousands of more houses built. So we're in direct opposition right now. So we're trying to form a housing task force, and I'm going back to our grant source. It's an organization under Department of Defense. And they've already told me they're willing to give us the money, but it's a process we got to go through. And we're going to get another grant to do Housing Study 2.0 and kind of do an audit as much as we can of the DoD study, NAR study, and try to bring them together. We won't have the money until 2023, but we're going to try to stand up the task force now, come up with its mission statement, its key objectives, its goals, its deliverables, and its timeline. If it's going to be a real long-term effort, and this is not my decision, it's our steering committee's decision, we might want to make a permanent formal working group for housing. Right now, this is an ad hoc housing task force. I told you about that new member we have, Operation Red Dot. It's a real estate firm. There right now, who we have going to lead that task force. I would love to get a community to help participate in that so we can kind of meter. These guys have a solution too, but I don't want them to only market their solution. I want them to take their hats off and say, hey, let's work this as a community-based problem, not a business problem for your business, but we got a big problem here. How can we do that? So we're going to talk about that tomorrow at steering.
Do we know the current breakdown and percentages of who lives on base and who lives off base right now? Are they pushing up against that 30% on
Yeah,
base?
we're at about 71% off. But with the DoD civilian workforce as well, that's about 15,000 more folks who can't live on base, but they work at JBLM. That means the JBLM workforce, 87 to 88% live off base. That 70% figure is just active duty.
How is on-base housing assigned? This might be a really basic question.
Yeah, it's sort of, well, you know what? Maria, I've done too much talking. Can you talk about how housing on base is assigned? Can you tackle that one?
Well, I think I can talk a little bit about it, yes. So the housing is situated on base by rank and by dependent size. And there are certain sections that are reserved. There are about 7,600 barracks, single service member barracks. And then we have
5,159 housing, family housing units.
So that's about,
Yeah. And then it just kind of depends your luck of the draw when you show up, what's available. You know, typically those houses are at about a 98% occupancy rate, and the 2% that are out are because they're getting turned over, new carpet, painting, whatever. They had a problem with black mold a couple of years ago, so they took more houses offline. They were down to 88% occupancy rate. I think they're now inching back up to a higher occupancy rate. But back then, that was forcing even more soldiers to live off base.
That's a tough structure if you assign by rank, because I assume as you go up in rank, your salary increases, but it's actually more expensive to live off base. So the people who make the least end up off base.
There's certain key positions that must live on base just for security reasons and stuff like that.
Totally backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the food insecurity is, and the cost of housing is an issue all across the United States. You know, I just came back from DC and the Military Communities Council there, and we had several communities from the largest installations that everyone's talking about the exact same thing. That the cost of housing has gone up so significantly since COVID over the past 2-3 years, as we all have experienced, right? It's not unique to this here, and yet their pay hasn't increased. And so what's left is what you give up, and they're just getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And on top of that, it's a typical issue with our military. They don't want to ask for help, so they don't self-report it either. And so that's why it's hard to get data on all this, is because they're like not saying they're from the military, but the wife's going and getting food while they can.
So my military experience is a little dated. I retired in 2013, but I was in for 30 years. And when you get PCS orders at one location and you're gonna know where you're gonna go next, you're gonna contact the housing office and say, how long's the waiting list? 12 months, 6 months, whatever the waiting list is. And then you've got to make a decision as a family. You're gonna move in, you're gonna wait for on-base housing and live in some hotel? Or are you gonna go get your own place to live? And part of it's the luck of the draw when you show up. But it's a real crapshoot. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Do you know, in the past 2 years with this housing crisis, have the BA rates adjusted effectively to help with that, to help compensate that cost?
Yeah, not much.
Not much.
In fact, this study that I mentioned, Robert D. Niehaus, and those guys provide the data to DOD to make the decision on basic allowance for housing.
And their interpretation is that the need is declining instead of accelerating.
And they've got to be able to.
Do you have his number? I can call.
No.
I can give him some stats.
Yeah. This is the exact same thing I just heard last week. They're complaining about the exact same data, saying, I don't know where they're getting this data from.
Yeah.
Reconciliation will be very interesting.
Yeah, I hope we get the funding for it. Yeah.
Good.
Bill, if you mentioned it, can you tell council what the cost of a bridge potentially would be and why federal help is actually critical?
Yeah, well, we have some early estimates on replacing the 2 bridges and the railroad trestles. It's a package deal. And it's approaching 4 billion. Now, that includes all the ecosystem, environmental remediation and all that too. Now, WashDOT thinks we're high. They think it's gonna be under 2 billion.
No.
And I asked them, does that include the environmental and ecological stuff? And they said, yes. So I took the number 4 billion off of this slide and just said best case construction. But I used to have 4 billion plus on there when I was talking to the state legislature earlier this year to get the money. So it's on everybody's radar screen as a very important and very high project if we get on.
No, I think it'll exceed 4 billion, I think.
Well,
Can't have federal money in any case, 2 billion, 4 billion.
and it's important definitely to make sure that the lanes are connecting, right? And that you're not having the exact same bottleneck that once you hit that. And so hopefully when they're planning for the future on this as well. So, and there is some worry that with this price tag being so big, and I know this solves some of the problems with going to exit 111, but the sort of the feeling is we're gonna get lucky if we can get through that, and then we're gonna run out of money. And so all that's gonna do is move the bottleneck right up to there.
Now, the 4 billion includes the 101 I-5 interchange.
Yeah.
It's not just Marvin Road to Mounts Road, it's the whole 17-mile stretch.
Holy cow.
Yeah, the whole stretch. But the overall feeling is like, okay, we know we have to get through Nisqually. We're gonna have to do that. So that's gonna be the first priority. And then there's gonna be burnout. Like, oh, you want another 2 million to do the rest of the corridor? And so there's a feeling like we're gonna get left behind. The rest of the corridor is gonna be left behind. We're gonna solve an important problem, but all it's just gonna move that problem to 111.
That's also in present dollars though. We're talking, you're not gonna be at construction point on this thing for 10 years if we're lucky.
I'm hoping 5.
Open
10 if we're lucky.
Yeah. We'll see how it
We're
goes.
talking federal project, we're talking 10.
But I know Lacey and Scott and Shannon have been big supporters of our work on this and testify on it, and I'm sure you do, Mayor. So we're all on this together, speaking with one voice, I hope.
Yep. Any other questions? Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Glad I could be with you.
This is great information.
Thanks, Maria.
So next up is our tree regulation revisions. Rick.
We got to, just making sure we're all transitioning on the screens. We have Ryan on with us in virtual. And as the council is aware, we have a draft ordinance that was scheduled to go before council at the last council meeting. The draft ordinance is to amend the existing city's tree regulations, LMC 1432. And time is going in the council amended the agenda to remove it to come to a work session to have a little bit further conversation and discussion and go over questions that the council may have regarding these proposed amendments. Real quick, just to kind of set the stage is, with this proposed draft and the packets before you tonight, there are 2 primary issues. One is looking to amend the permit threshold for single family lots for tree removal. That permit threshold is known as the 5 and 3, the ability to remove 5 trees within a 3-year period and be exempt from the land clearing permit process. So you come in over a counter, an applicant would identify the number of trees on their lot, where they're located, and they get an over counter permit. They can still remove potentially more than 5 trees today by going through a land clearing process, which is a process very similar to a site plan review process. It's a higher level review, we have a forestry report, and it goes through a more substantial public notice process. The second issue in the ordinance that's being looked at is the ability to for HOAs or to be able to remove trees from HOA owned properties, tree tracks, and commercial properties as well. And currently there is not a path or vehicle or process that an HOA or a commercial property could use to go in and have consideration to remove trees. And so the proposed amendments in the packet or in the draft ordinance include a permitting pathway, the land clearing process, but also is subject to several things. One, you have to have the forest report to do an assessment of the trees being removed and the overall site. You also have to meet certain criteria, which include that you have to document that there's some type of property damage being caused by those trees, or that the routine maintenance or the practicality of maintaining those trees is not feasible. And then finally, that they're not designated or determined to be specimen trees, which is defined in the ordinance as a high quality tree with a certain context. Also, if they were allowed to remove trees under that process, then they would have to replant for that tree removal at a ratio depending on the size of the tree. So if it's say 6 inches in caliper or less, they'd replace it at 1 tree. If it's 24 inches in diameter or more, at 7 trees, and then a graduated scale in between. So a minimum of 1 tree replacement, depending on the small tree. 6 inches in diameter is basically the width of an iPhone or the length of an iPhone, to give you context.
Can I
Yes.
ask a quick question? Have we ever had anyone inquire about transplanting a tree?
We have had that come up over the years, not necessarily on a individual lot or an HOA, but through development projects. We have, through land use reviews, found significant trees on a property and had them transplanted elsewhere on the property. And 2 locations that I know of is, if you know the Summerlock development, those trees along Yelm Highway on the west side of Park Place Drive. Those trees along Yelm Highway were transplanted from the northern portion of the site closer to where the park was.
Oh,
And
interesting.
Then also Crossroads, we had a lot of ash trees or tree trees that we had transplanted in up closer to Corporate Center Drive. So, because otherwise it'd be removed because of the vacation of right of way. So there are ways that we can do transplanting of trees, and that has been utilized in the past.
Okay.
So anyways, those are the two issues that are being considered in the proposed amendments to the ordinance. This has gone through an extensive process. It's gone through a tree track advisory committee that has provided a recommendation. It's also gone through the planning commission process and with open house. It also went through a virtual open house as well as a planning commission review and their public hearing process, and they've made a recommendation. And it also through this time period has been before the land use committee 4 times, as well as this is our 4th work session with the council to talk about some of the issues with the tree ordinance as well. So it's gone through quite a bit of conversation and opportunity and information. So tonight, again, just want to ladies think there's a lot of information in the packet, and it's been through this quite a bit. The options for council is either to at the point you reschedule for action, your action would be either to adopt the changes proposed in the draft ordinance or reject them or one or the other. You have those options. You have a full record that you have the flexibility to look at that as well. And the other thing too, there's been a lot of comments from certain groups and individuals from the community and beyond that had concerns or questions. And as staff, we have interacted with them on an individual basis and talking about the issues and making sure that they had all the information of what the actual proposed amendments are going to be. So with that, and tonight we thought that we have Ryan here in the virtual screen with the presentation. He can go in more detail about the proposals, or we can just open it up for questions and comments from the council, whatever they would like to wish.
Would be nice is to have like a visual presentation on trees on a piece of property, what can be taken down under this our current ordinance, what can be taken down under the new ordinance. Because it's so hard to put this into the number of trees. You talk about a percentage of a tree canopy. I don't know what that looks like. What people understand is number of trees. You're talking about a canopy.
Well, you're mixing 2 different things there.
I know.
Because the canopy comes out of the urban forestry plan. And that's looking at a goal of maintaining the existing canopy based on the assessment that was done through this process. Part of the development of an update of the urban forestry plan was we did take a GIS look at current tree canopy to start as a benchmark. And there was some confusion because people wanted to relate that to a tree canopy survey that we did years ago, but that was done by manually looking at aerial photographs and just drawing circles. And so there's 2 different ways. So that was not very accurate to compare the 2. So we don't want to lose tree canopy, but then you make it down to the individual properties and property development. You're looking at individual trees. Ultimately, we still have a process for people to utilize their property, protect trees. It's just a matter of what does that permitting process should look like, and should a single family lot still maintain a limit for an exemption of removal of 5 trees in 3 years, or is it just remove that exempt permit threshold and rely on what's on the books today of a minimum tree ratio standard that right now it's 1 tree per every 5,000 square foot of lot size would be have to maintain on a lot. So for an example, on a 10,000 square foot lot, that's a minimum of 2 trees. If you have an acre lot, that gets up to 42 trees. So that's the difference in lot size and square.
So clarify something for me, Rick, because a lot of the emails, a lot of the questions we got had to do, going back to the canopy, and a lot of the commentary was that over the last 15 years, we've lost 15% of our tree canopy. Is that accurate or no? Because we're comparing 2 completely different types of studies. Have we actually lost tree canopy?
I would say that it is not accurate because of those 2 different types. We don't have accurate grounding. But if you just look at the 2 studies, yeah, you can make that assertion. But we now have a more a GIS-based study that we did with this process that now going forward, we can monitor and track. Are we going to continue to lose canopy or are we going to gain? Also, when you look at the last, as we talked about in some previous presentations I've made to council, there's been a lot of development activity, not much less over the last 20 years, but over the last 5 years. As that developments are built and then they mature, that tree canopy, the replanting of trees is going to grow as well. And those are not necessarily picked up on this process because those trees are just planted. As they grow and mature above the roof line, that also could be something that you'll see increase in tree canopy moving forward. So it's a moving target in a sense in trying to assess them.
I think there's what the concern is right now is right now, you can only allowed to take, 5 trees in 3 years, right? Or 3 trees in 5 hours. What's the number?
So right now, it's an exempt process to remove 5 trees within a 3-year period, but you can still pursue to remove more than 5 going through a land clearing process.
And so I guess what the thought is if we get rid of that, then people can just go to the minimum tree canopy standard, and you could end up taking down considerably more than 5 trees.
It's not a tree canopy standard, it's a tree ratio on your lot. We're not looking at canopy on an individual lot. It's how many trees you are required to have in your lot based on your lot size. So it's a ratio, and that ratio is graduated the larger the lot, the more trees.
And where'd you come up with that number?
That number came out of the 2006 update. Is that correct, Ryan? 2006.
That's correct. Yeah.
And that was a result of that council at the time where we started seeing some of these more difficult sites to develop, and you started seeing mass clearing. The last phases of Avonlea, the DNR properties, now Lacey Market, there was a lot of trees that came down because you had the balance of sites and utilities and all that make grades work. And so in the review of the urban forestry plan up at that time and the concerns with the public, community and council, that's when they adopted that tree ratio standard of 1 tree per every 5,000 square feet. That's where that came from. And came out of that robust public process as well.
So I guess the most basic of questions, if we adopted the change, did away with the 5 trees in 3 years, does that really allow people to remove more trees than they're removing? Or does it really get us that same net result? Because that's what the concern seems to be from all the emails, right? If we remove that, people are going to be able to remove more trees. But if we still have a minimum number of trees, based on the size of the lot, does that really make the change that they're afraid is going to happen?
So if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, somebody had 4 trees on that lot, we could come in and remove all those trees without any permit review. And today, because under that permit threshold, they would have to replant their minimum amount of trees based on that lot size. So there's still a replanting plan.
So they can remove all 4, they'd have to replant 2 because it's 10,000 feet, so they'd have to have 2 trees.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And then if you had 15 trees on that 10,000 square foot lot, which is a lot of trees on a lot, they could remove currently with just an over-counter permit exemption, remove 5 trees, but they also could request to remove more based on a land clearing process. If you remove that permit threshold, they would still be able to remove those 5 trees without with basically an overcount, but if they want to do more, they still would have to have a forestry review. The forester would go out, look at the trees, provide information and education so that they're making a more of an informed choice of removing those trees, but then they would still have to plant back their minimum amount of trees. So there could be more trees removed. Maybe we look on an acre lot or a 2-acre lot, that may have 100 trees on it. That person would still only be able to remove under exemption requirements 5 trees every 3 years. So there's where that kind of balance that the planning commission looked at, as well as the tree advisory task force, is you have some different context of lots out there in terms of size and number of trees.
Is it, again, I think it's really hard to do this on a tree without a visual, like what is the average 10,000 square foot lot? How many trees are on an average 10,000 square foot lot now in the city of Lacey? Do we have any idea what that number is?
No. And if we did try to provide that information, that would take some money, staff resources, and time to be able to develop that information. Unless, Ryan, do you know if we have that information?
I mean, what I'd be happy to do is run through some slides that I have that show average lots in Lacey and what they're able to remove versus what larger lots are able to remove. And really, it's a fairness issue. You know, essentially, a small lot that has a few number of trees is able to take out all of their trees every 3 years because they have 5 or less trees. Versus a large lot, we have many of along our lakes, especially, that have acres of trees, and they're subject to the same 5-tree removal permit that anybody else is. And so, you know, essentially, on one hand, you've got a single-family lot owner able to clear cut every year, versus the same single-family lot owner that's only able to take down 5 trees on their, you know, 2-acre lot. So it may help. I've got some slides. It would, you know, if it fancies the council, I'd be happy to bring those up. We can take a look at those. It may make some more sense.
It's always good to have a visual. Go ahead.
Okay.
Maybe a question and a comment. One, the way that we gathered the data in 2006 for the tree canopy versus the way that we gathered it for 2021, there were two different, it was sort of like eyeballing it in 2006, and then we actually had computer imaging gather the data in 2000. Just because it was two different ways of gathering the data doesn't mean that the tree canopy hasn't actually decreased, which is that 15% is like comparing apples. I don't want it to be on record that we have no idea if the tree canopy actually decreased or not, because we could do a visual assessment of the data for 2021 overall, because we've had a bunch of stuff built.
That's completely accurate. I didn't want to make the assertion that we did have a decrease. I'm just saying comparing those two and using that as a metric is not a way to measure that. And you also have these variables that with our tree regulations in place, there's a lot of replanting occurred with all that development. So as time goes on, that's going to grow and mature, and you're going to see that canopy mature as well.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, Rick's already touched on a lot of this. You know, the council's already adopted the urban forest management plan, and I'll just mention when it comes to tree canopy, you know, the plan says that we're at 29% now. Originally, we were at 40% back in 2006, I think it was. Development has a lot to do with that, and we've put in triggers within the urban forest management plan that says, hey, if we continue to drop, then we need to look at our regulations and increase tree protections if that was to happen. Our feeling as staff is that with the new methodology that we use is way more accurate than essentially the remote sensing aerial photograph method that was used in 2006. So we need to set the baseline now rather than 2006 being that baseline. As far as the permit pathways, I think Rick's done a really good job of explaining this. The tree tracks and open spaces, commercial development permit pathways, as well as the residential lot threshold. I wanted to bring up this graphic because I think it really helps illustrate, and the council, I believe, has seen this before at our work session back in December, which illustrates what tree protection, what is the most restrictive when it comes to tree protection. The first is historical trees. We don't have any in Lacey, but we do have a process that if we did have historical trees, we have essentially a register, like a historic register, that we would be putting them on, and they would be essentially forever protected. And that's a private nomination process, just like a house or, you know, historic structure. Critical area buffer would be the next one down the scale. So that's, excuse me, within a wetland or a wetland buffer. A specimen tree, as Rick mentioned, specimen trees are kind of the best of the breed, the best of the kind, and those are identified through a tree report that's done through a tree removal permit request, whether as part of a development or on an individual lot. Within our parks is the next, we're kind of midway down the chart here. So now we get into those that are applicable here. So we're looking, when we're talking about our tree removal permit process right now, we're looking at kind of the lower half of the scale, those that don't require as much protection. And so, you know, it's really important when you get all these concerns about tree protection. I truly believe the city is doing a fantastic job in protecting trees. I've worked for the city for a long time, and you know, yes, there are always pressures. There's pressures to develop. There's pressures to develop around trees. The city does a fantastic job of doing its job around all these trees. And so when it comes down to it, we're really looking at tree tracks and open spaces, commercial properties, and residential lots, which again are identified in our urban forest management plan as those that should have the least restrictive regulations.
If I can just hold right there, Ryan, I'm back
Yep.
on that slide. as we went through this process, both to the tree advisory committee as well as the plan commission, the top 5 storage trees, critical area buffers, specimen trees, parks, and tree tracks was identified as that was the most important to protect, and also where you have the best gains of maintaining canopy, because those are areas that are impacted by development or just housing, living, and gardening, whatever that is. And so trying to also preserve trees in the lower tier, the 6 and 7, but then also providing that you're going to have conflict between a native tree, which the Douglas fir is not the best with impacted roots and root rot or moving around and housing or commercial developments, to provide a mechanism to review those situations, but also provide flexibility, which is I think what the council asked for when you first started this process 2 years ago.
Yep. So here is the tree in front of the Greenbrier development on 45th Avenue between College and Riddle. This is kind of the tree that started it all, or trees that started it all. I think there's 2 of them there.
Remembers that situation?
That was brought to the council, and the council directed basically the reopening of the urban forest management plan to take a look at this issue. So when it comes to these types of open spaces and commercial properties, Rick mentioned this as well, but really it's a property owner can apply for a land clearing permit, and that's what happened with Greenbrier. But based on the city's arborist recommendation, that permit may be denied. And the council at a work session directed us to come up with a new permit process, which we've called the land clearing permit light process. It's basically a administrative process. So a staff level decision that's based on the city's arborist report. And really this has some criteria associated with it, a documented history of property damage, typical maintenance and pruning is infeasible of the tree, and the tree doesn't meet the criteria for a specimen tree in order to be removed. But it would be possible now. So Greenbrier could use this permit pathway to do that. They would have to replant. And so those are 2 large trees. Probably one is probably more than 25-inch caliper, so that they'd have to replant 7. The other one's probably a little smaller, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 5. So, Greenbrier could take those 2 trees down, but they'd have to plant a dozen, give or take, to meet the standard. So, what you're getting is a trade-off. You're getting a trade-off for, okay, you can take down a large tree or trees within an open space, or even within a commercial development in let's say a parking lot landscape island, but you're required to plant substantially more back in its place.
I've got a couple of questions.
So in the case of Greenbrier, do they have a particular spot where they would have to essentially plant a dozen trees if they get the green light on taking down that one? Are they planning on putting that in a common area, or do you know where the new plants are going to go?
Yeah.
It's up to the HOA to identify where those would go.
That's what I'm asking you. Have they identified that?
They didn't get to that far because when they first came into this request, it was denied because it didn't qualify.
Okay.
But they do have open space tracts and areas that they could replant in.
Okay.
Now, if they can't, there's also an option written into the draft amendments that would allow payment into the trees, the city's tree account, that the city would plant trees elsewhere out in the city where there'd be more suitable locations.
It's a fee in lieu process.
Is there any limitation, minimum size of those additional? So they have to plant 12 trees, but I mean.
Yep, they're 1.5-inch caliper for deciduous or 6 foot for conifers. And that's the same as any tree in any tree tract. So it's the same as if that was a new development.
Thank you.
Yep. Moving on, so with those new trees, there'd have to be a report that would come along with it. Obviously, a replanting plan that would be done because you can't just, take a tree and put it in a new spot without a lot of care and attention. So, our forester, our arborist would help them come up with that replanting plan and look at what the tree suitability would be for those areas, including a species recommendation. So, where our species are changing, our climate's getting warmer. And so trees that were surviving even 10 years ago, according to our Parks Department, are not anymore. And so we really have to look closely at what those species are that are able to tolerate our hot, dry summers. Locations, that's something that would have to be analyzed with this as well, as Councilmember Kunkel brought up, and then a maintenance and irrigation plan to ensure survival. So, not to say that they need to install irrigation, but they need to do regular watering of these trees to make sure they survive. as well as a timeline for their replacement. So, the middle of a hot, dry summer is not the time to replant a tree, but the fall, October, November is the perfect time. So, to make sure that we have a timeline associated with these replantings. So Rick touched on this a lot as well. The proposed removal of the permit threshold of 5 trees in a 3-year period. Permits would still be. Yep.
That's the question.
Yep.
Do the replanted trees then become exempt from being cut and moved in the future? Or?
Well, as they grow and mature, there's that process of a permitting review process that they still need to be either thinned out or removed, and it'll go through that same process.
Unless that council changes it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about the permit threshold, which is the 5 trees in a 3-year period. And, with the drafts, the permits would still be required for all residential tree removals, provided that they meet, number 1, the tree ratio of 4 trees per 5,000 square feet of lot area are retained or replanted. That's our current regulation. So really you have 2 things at play. You have a permit threshold, which is 5 trees in a 3-year period, and you have a regulation of 4 trees per 5,000 square feet. What the proposal is in front of you is to actually remove the 5 trees in a 3-year period permit threshold, but keep the regulations of 4 trees per 5,000 square feet. The second bullet is important as well, is that any tree removals of more than 5 trees requires a report prepared by our arborist. And that's an important thing because it provides the opportunity for the arborist to go out and do education and outreach like they are doing now for those larger scale tree removals. But it gives people a pathway to be able to remove more than 5 trees. And that last bullet is important. It addresses the fairness issues based on property size. And I'll show this here in a second.
So
yep, here it is. Okay, go ahead.
One other thing too, and I apologize, I said 1 per 5, it's actually 4. But the other thing too is any tree removal that achieves like 5,000 board feet also requires a DNR permit. And so that's basically a log truck load of trees would require that forest practice permit that we administer, but that's also like a land clearing process as well. So that's another tier. So if somebody had 15 trees and they want to remove them all, they'd still be subject to a permit review process with that forest practices permit.
Yep, and the over-the-counter permit still remains. People still need a permit, and it would be a ministerial permit issued at our counter as we move into this. So again, permits are required. It's not that somebody's not able to, that we're not issuing permits or reviewing these things anymore, because we certainly would keep doing that. So here's the first example. This is a 5,000 square foot lot. So essentially every lot that we've, got in Northeast Lacey, this is just, I pulled a random lot that had 4 existing trees. Our existing permit threshold would allow up to 5 trees removed in a 3-year period. So where those yellow stars are, it was kind of hard to see where the trees were. Those are trees. And the property owner here would be able to take down and replant every one of those trees every 3 years, because they're 5,000 square foot lot, 4 trees per 5,000 square feet. They could remove those and replant those under current regulations and future regulations as well. Here is a lot that is on Long Lake. This is a 2.5 acre lot with 220 existing trees. This was a application that the city received. They wanted to do some tree removals, had a significant number of trees, and because they were not allowed to remove more than 5 trees, their permit was essentially denied. So this existing permit threshold would allow up to 5 trees removed in a 3-year period, even though they had 220 existing trees. So you could take that 4 tree per 5,000 square foot threshold and apply it to 2.5 acres, and you get a lot of trees. That's one safeguard there. And as Rick mentioned as well, if you take down more than 1 logging truck load, you're also pushed into a higher permit threshold. So we have safeguards, we have requirements, we have permits, and we have reviews that apply here that would prohibit the clear cutting of this lot. It would allow tree removal, but it would allow the same tree removal at the same rate that the property on the left is receiving as well. So again, here, that's kind of for the visual learners of the group, just like I am, here is the pathway to be able to remove a tree on a residential lot, provided that you have 4 trees per 5,000 square feet, and provided that any trees more than 5 requires a report, you're issued that ministerial permit, that exemption permit card at our front counter. In addition, there are some general housekeeping amendments. I know that's not what we're here to talk about tonight, just to be aware of for your general information. Rick also did a good job of summarizing this. We had the Tree Task Force and the Planning Commission both give a very robust recommendation. Number one, their main recommendation was that protecting, educating, regulating, and enforcing are the 4 kind of hallmarks that make up a holistic tree program, and that's needed. And what we're doing here tonight is talking about the regulating part of those 4 kind of tenets of the tree program. There were generally some very minor amendments proposed. So these are, we're not looking at a major overhaul of our urban forest management plan nor regulations. We really have those 2 key items. It's a reminder too that through the public process and through the Planning Commission's recommendation, making healthy HOA and commercial tree removals easier were not supported. So the recommendation of the Planning Commission is to not adopt that. This has been something that has been solely directed by the City Council to come up with this permit pathway. The amendments to permit thresholds for residential lots for the removal of the 5 trees in a 3-year period were supported. So that was supported by the Planning Commission based on primarily on that fairness issue when it came to different size lots. So just as a reminder, you'll have an ordinance in front of you, you've got some information there on the screen. I'm not going to rehash. I think we've talked about it all tonight. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and be able to turn over to you for any questions or remarks.
So let me try to reframe the policy question before council. So I think you really have 2 areas that you're trying to discuss or decide upon. One is the open space, which is your HOAs, and you also have your true tracks, which relate to commercial areas. Currently, right now, there is no exemption if you have a tree that causes, say, property damage or called a nuisance issue. So council, I think, was sympathetic about that issue, especially going to Greenbrier, and they said, well, can you find an avenue, a very narrow avenue, to allow for a unique exemption? So that is currently before you. Do you want to allow an HOA the ability to get a narrow exemption if a tree is causing ongoing property damage?
Permit process.
Yeah, permitted process.
Yeah,
Because right now, that's
what
not
brought
allowed.
this whole thing. I mean, that's exactly
Actually,
why
what
we
brought
brought
this
this,
whole thing.
is we wanted to be able to do that.
So that is a key issue of this current revised ordinance that would allow that avenue.
Before we move on to the second issue, does anybody have any other questions on that particular permit process for commercial or HOA or tree tracks? Tree removals?
I have a different question, always.
Okay.
So is council comfortable with that direction of the ordinance?
Yeah.
Okay.
My only concern is it just, in all sympathy to HOAs. I mean, I'm president of HOA with a lot of trees, I get it, but it almost feels like the tail is wagging the dog on this whole big picture here. And I think we need to keep a holistic perspective as we go forward on this.
So you as an HOA president, you have to answer to the residents that live in that neighborhood. You're gonna have some folks that are okay with the proposed plan to take down a tree or 2. But you're gonna have other neighbors and be like, whoa, wait a second here. So you have a different balancing act as wearing that hat of HOA president. And that's the same for any other HOA. Their neighbors are going to tell their leadership.
But it requires a permit, and it's a tree that's causing property damage.
Right.
So I mean, there's a legitimate, it's not like we're just saying, yeah, remove any tree you want.
It's a narrow.
If it's breaking sidewalk, roads, whatever, I mean, so there's a good reason for removing that tree.
Right,
And
right.
it doesn't meet the definition of a hazard, which is already an exemption in the
Right.
policy.
A hazard tree is already an exemption. And also it can't be considered a specimen tree. So in the condition of the Greenbrier, that may or may not allow that particular tree to be removed, because that is probably could be considered a specimen tree, but then you have to balance it with what is the potential property damage and hazard that could be maintained. So there's that, it's a Subject review is going to rely on the recommendations of the forester and staff to figure out how this would fit in and meet all those criteria.
So the other point I want to make too, I know the issue about canopy, we're all concerned about the urban canopy. We want to make this the best possible city in terms of livability. I think the difficulty comparing a 2006 standard to today is that we have to realize that we are probably a community of 35,000. We are now, 55,000. So the places like a Jubilee or, Summerwalk, those subdivisions were built during that time period. And yes, there is going to be a loss of canopy. That's a fact of really an outcome of the Growth Management Act. We want the development to occur in the urban areas, not in the rural areas. So again, if you're okay with the narrow avenue for an exemption for an HOA or a commercial tract, then the question is before council is, what are you willing to allow a private property owner to remove on their parcel? And I was going to put Rick on the spot a little bit on this one. I don't know of many Washington cities that have a regulation that you can't remove trees on a lot. I would say we're a very small family of cities that allow that. Do you know that?
There are several. I wouldn't say they're a very few minority, but there are several trees across the state that have tree regulations, and they do regulate the removal of trees. Now, to different levels of whether it's related to development or individual property owners, there's all different graduated scales in there. So I don't want to say yes or no. There is a lot of flexibility or variety across the state.
And so I guess I'm sorry. let me just throw this in here, and I just want to clear this up once and for all. From what we were hearing from several members of the public is they felt like this new ordinance was going to make it easier to cut down more trees. And that's what we were hearing, right? It's like, it was going to be, don't pass this, it's going to be easier to cut down more healthy trees.
Well, we have quite a few requests for exempt tree removals for single family lots. However, we also have a lot of replanting through that process as well for those minimum standards with the 4 per 5,000, not the 4 to 5,000 I just spoke about earlier. And so there is that constant process. Now, just because you take that permit exemption doesn't mean that there isn't a monitoring of what's happening. They still have to come in and notify us of that tree removal. And if it's over that 5 threshold, then it triggers that tree protection. So there is a graduated step. It's just not going from an exemption to a full-blown land use clearing permit. So then there's the opportunity, as Ryan said, the opportunity for promotion, education. That tree is really not a danger of a tree, because we get a lot of requests spike after large windstorms and those type of things. Mm-hmm. But then the foresters go out and do really good. Like, well, that's not really a hazard, and here's what you can do for maintenance. And a lot of people don't necessarily want to just take out trees. They take it out of other reasons. And once they have that conversation, they sometimes change their mind. So it creates that interaction point. And then, of course, if those larger properties, they get, they're taking out large, then it graduates up to the forest practices permit, and that takes on a little bit higher level review as well.
Do these two issues have to be lumped together?
That was going to be the dent of my question, and I appreciate Scott laying it out as 2 separate policy questions, because the ordinance was presented to us and you said you have the option of rejecting or approving the ordinance, but is there a third option where we amend the ordinance?
You can amend that ordinance, you can adopt it, move it forward as is, or you can deny it as is, or you can say, we do like the process for HOAs and commercial properties, we'll keep that. We want to also keep the exemption threshold for the 5 tree removal and 3, you can still keep that, or you can say, so you have that option within the ordinance and ultimately your action to make those fine tuning.
Mr. Mayor, to your question, if we adopt the recommendation to take out the 5 tree, it does let trees be cut down faster. Like that picture showed that they could clear cut that whole lot of 200 trees and replant 4 per 5,000 square feet. It does let more trees be cut down. That piece of it.
Yeah. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that they could come in. We would be looking at a
Ryan is saying no.
land clearing practice, right? You get the forest practice permit and.
Yeah, that lot would not be allowed to be clear cut at that point. They still would have to maintain their 5 trees per 5,000 square feet. So
how many trees is that?
87.
For a 2 acre lot, it'd be 87 trees.
Right. And then anything that is above a logging truckload requires a forest practice application, requires a land clearing permit, and is subject to a administrative level review, which could be denied just like any other large clearing is today. So, you know, there are safeguards in place that would provide, you know, or prohibit the clearing of individual lots like that.
So the concern is, let's use that lot, for example, it would take 15 years theoretically. I'm sorry, 9 years to get rid of 15 trees, if that was the motivation of the property owner. So the concern is the acceleration of that process. I mean, that's the debated point. I think the only difference right now that we currently have now, we do have obviously the 5 trees and 3 rule. We also have the tree density. The planning commission did recommend to remove the 5-3 scenario. So the question is council comfortable with that?
And again, this is not something you necessarily need to make a decision tonight on that. This is just purpose of just trying to get the information to you so you have something to think about as it comes before.
Well, I think it was important to hear the actual numbers because it's really difficult to visualize that, right? On what the new regulations will allow compared to our existing regulations and what are the actual numbers. That's what's so difficult to figure out. And when you can't really do the math off the top of your head, like the deputy mayor just did, you think that all the trees are coming down, right? And it scares
But also too, in that same situation, that lot, they were building an accessory building. And so it can remove the trees in the footprint of the accessory building and 10 feet within. But they also had future plans to build some additional accessory uses on the property that they could be allowed under code. But they weren't ready to do that financially yet, but they were taking down the trees. And so they were looking at actually taking down several more trees, and they were actually denied because it was above that threshold. That's where Ryan gets back into that fairness and equity. They still had over 150 trees on the parcel, more than their ratio. So that's where that issue came up on, is there's an equity between lot sizes and number of trees when you have that type of property improvement plans for your own property.
Any have any questions?
I would just say, I know you don't need an answer today, but it's probably easier if you have some direction from us, I'm guessing, so you know what to bring back to us to vote on, right? When we're gonna vote on this.
Well, I didn't want to put you all under pressure to think.
No, I
There's a
know
lot
what
of
I'm saying.
information
I
right
just-
now too to think
Just
about.
throwing that out there, that it's probably helpful for
And the-
you and for Dave, so he can actually put something in front of us that we can vote on, right?
And also too, we can be available for follow-up questions and information as well.
Sure.
Does anyone else have any other questions? I really appreciate just more of this explanation, and so I could visually understand what we were talking about here.
I'm much more comfortable voting on it
Yeah.
now.
Councilor Vasquez?
It helps when we're in person too.
Yeah, it's so much better to have this discussion in
Right.
person.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like we could get to at least closer to a decision tonight. And I want to be clear that I appreciate the work that staff has done on this, because y'all have been working on this and trying to listen to what everybody wanted and come up with something that would work for like a year. So thank you so much for your work.
Mhm.
But I mean, I think I was on the planning commission, obviously, when this got voted on initially, when all this stuff got discussed at planning commission. And I think my perspective on some of these things has evolved since then. So I feel like I know more now about the concerns from the HOA, the Greenbrier saga,
Mhm.
you know, and I also feel like I have a better visual picture of what that 5 and 3 really means.
Mhm.
So the reason I asked the question about amending the ordinance is because I think I might be able to live with the HOA exemption. But I have real concerns about the 5 and 3. Because we can't just talk about trees as an individual resource, right? They are doing something for our community. And so taking down 200 trees to replant 87 makes me really nervous. Ryan just said we have to pick different trees to plant because we have hotter summers now. It's a related issue.
But I think Ryan said you couldn't take down 87 trees, would still have to stay there,
Right.
right?
Or you'd replant them. So you could cut them all down and replant 87.
Did you do that, Ryan?
Nope, you'll have to retain 4 trees per 5,000 square feet. So we wouldn't let you go under that threshold.
On a single lot, you can cut down all 4 and replant them?
Not with the.
Correct.
But you couldn't on
Missing
it,
some.
yeah. That doesn't make
Right.
sense.
We have other guards in place. We talked about the one logging truck load thing, right? Anything above and beyond that is going to require a land clearing permit, which is subject to an administrative decision and would be denied if there's no, reason to have to remove those trees other than clear cutting.
Maybe a Rick or Ryan walk through that. So again, using that 2 acre, which is a very heavily treated lot, I think what we're saying is that has the ability to go through a land clearing process, which is a full administrative review. You're going through tree practices. So there could be a requirement depending on the removal of trees to set aside a tree tract or something like that, but also meet the tree density.
So that's in the old ordinance, or if we were to adopt it, that nothing changes for that lot, really, from the old ordinance to the new ordinance.
Yeah, for the small lot, nothing essentially would change. It would be all related to the large lots that are going to be regulated based on the regulations instead of being limited by their permit thresholds.
I think you still have questions.
Do I have a face like?
There's a thought bubble there. I just can't see it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that worries me too is when we talk numbers of trees, you could talk about having 4 trees on a lot, but are they 4 essentially twigs? I mean, 1.5-inch caliber is a skinny little sapling basically, or even a 6-foot conifer. That's not a tree that's really going to do the job that we're, in our climate mitigation plan, that we're talking about trees sequestering carbon.
So then what would your recommendation be?
I don't have a specific recommendation. I think we need to realize that tension between development and growing the community with some of the things this council is trying to address and has been for years, the impact of carbon emissions and reducing those, and how we, look at this policy through multiple lenses. And I just think we need to not let that fall away from the table in the conversation.
One of the things that both the Tree Advisory Task Force and the Planning Commission worked on, and Ryan, please correct me, is they looked at that overall community issue, and they looked at tree canopy in a general sense, and then also a conversation at the regional level on our climate action plan with the sequestration studies. So when they had that conversation, they looked at the best place to preserve trees was in those critical areas, in those larger park areas and tree track areas. And so again, balancing those things and plus the needs of property and the other goals of the comp plan in terms of development, economic development, all the other aspects of it. That was all trying to balance into their recommendation. And it is that pinch point where you have, the human environment, if you will, or the built environment with the natural environment. And a lot of times the natural environment is very much easier to maintain in those larger tracts, those sensitive areas, those open space areas.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. None of us want clear cutting just for the sake of clear cutting. And I think the biggest safeguard here is the average logging truck load. If you go over that triggers, basically prevents clear cutting, especially if you're cutting bigger trees, because you're going to not be able to have as many trees on that load. I think it as close as you possibly can policy-wise meets everybody's concerns. And the concerns are canopy and, the bigger trees do the most benefit. So I think this is the best option to satisfy everybody, especially the saving of the big trees. So that's my opinion.
I feel a lot better after talking this through a little bit more too. I had some questions, but I feel like the majority of my questions have been answered at this point. And so I feel pretty good going forward with the recommendation that we have. I just I really felt like we need to talk through it. If you have, you know, between now and next Thursday, if you have something specific that you want to bring up to the council, you know, we can talk about then, but I mean, I don't know what else we could more we could tweak this. I feel like you've done a pretty good job. And I just needed to visualize it, understand this just one last more time before we just voted on it. So that's why I wanted to come to.
And I just want to clear on, I think, with the bigger, taller trees sequestering more carbon, and then if you take one of those down, you have to plant 7 new trees. I think that's where the balance is, where they're trying to create the balance here.
Right, that's my issue. But we can, that's only HOAs.
Correct.
Why don't we make that a standard across the city?
Well, I think you also have to be just understanding the physical space. So, I mean, Ryan had that good lot about 5,000 square feet. That's a tight area. So you have a large tree on a lot. At some point, you're gonna run out of room. You're gonna start to disturb a foundation, a fence, a neighbor's yard, those type of things.
I understand it, but shouldn't there be some requirements if you're gonna cut down a big tree to replant? No matter what?
Well, that's a completely different policy question. So again, I'm not trying to oversimplify this, but our current standard is now you have a tree density, which speaks to we would like to have an urban canopy. That doesn't go to the size or scale of it, but that tells you we want so many trees per 5,000 square feet. The only thing that's changing is we used to have a procedural process of when you get to remove a tree, which was, can you remove 5 trees within 3 years? So that's really the scope of really what this policy is. And so issues that Councilmember Cox raised about the health and species and size, that's a completely different discussion that we've never really had a debate about around the table.
That's why I was wondering why these two have to be stuck together.
Well, that's one of the options that the council has in considering this. You can adopt a amended ordinance that includes the permitting pathways for HOAs and commercial properties, but also keep the permit threshold of 5 and 3. Or you can keep both those in there, or you can, you know, move the other. And so you have that option. And ultimately, the 5 and 3 permit threshold is a threshold that was originally put into the ordinance in the mid-90s when it was originally created for a lot of the concerns you've talked about here tonight about the rate of a homeowner being able to remove the trees. That was why it was put in there. And when the planning commission and advisory group reviewed it this last year, they said, well, why do you have the both? You have the tree ratio, minimum tree ratio requirements. There's a governor. And then you have this as a permit threshold. Do you need both? That's a recommendation, but the council has the ability to look at that and say, well, do we still want to keep that permit threshold and the minimum tree density, or remove that in looking at, and you see the 2 examples of the 2 different types of property, the extreme properties, you know, the 5,000 square foot lot with 4 trees and the larger one that has a lot of trees. And it would create the opportunity for that larger lot owner to remove more trees in the 5 and 3 year period over the course of time.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, Rick, if council chooses not to amend the portion dealing with the private lots, then you still have the 5 years and 3 years and the tree density.
Yep. Yes.
If you take the planning commission recommendation, then you'd only remove the 5 trees in 3 years, but you'd still have the tree density. That's really the only change within the ordinance.
That and the one for the HOAs, but
Correct.
we're all on the same page on
Right.
that.
Right. I mean, if there's an indication or direction from council, it would be helpful. 1, I guess 2, when is council ready to take action on it? And 2, if that's the way council's leaning, you know, we could prepare an ordinance that would have.
I think we've talked about it enough times. We've had it at enough meetings that I think it needs to be before us for a vote at, you know, at this point. I mean, how many more, you know, times we need to discuss?
Can I just get like a house straw pull up?
Next Thursday is the 5th Thursday, right?
Yeah, there's no.
Yeah, so it won't be next
April.
Thursday.
So we're 2 weeks out from.
How are you feeling about staff recommendation? Planning commission recommendation.
I would feel, I would be supportive at this point.
Supportive.
I don't like them being stuck together. But I like helping the HOAs, but I don't know if the other thing is fully baked. It seems right, but.
Okay, Mike? All right, where are you at on this?
You know, honestly, I support both, but I like the staff's recommendation the best. I think it has the most safeguards and It represents everybody citywide. I think staff did a wonderful job.
Well,
And then,
yeah,
did you have any other?
Just procedurally, what would typically happen here is the council refers to an ordinance that's likely going to be scheduled for, if it's not changed.
Hey guys, if I can, sorry, can we make sure we're talking to the microphone?
oh, yeah,
Not just for me, but for the public.
yeah.
Those mics over there not working.
The mics do work, but I think I was a little
Far
far away.
away.
If nothing changes tonight, there's going to be an ordinance before council at a future council.
Mhm.
What would typically happen when an ordinance is presented, I mean, someone's going to move to adopt it perhaps. Second, it'd be discussion and then a vote. If it passes, that's it, we're done. If it doesn't pass, council can always pursuant to that discussion, talk about, well, why, would it pass if we remove this section? And then someone would normally in that situation amend the motion to exclude this particular section. And then if that's seconded, and then that's the process that would typically be taken. To separate into two separate ordinances, they all relate to the same LMC section. So that's awkward. It's all 1432. So if council is going to amend Title 1432, it should do so in one ordinance.
They're already built together.
And then the first motion could be also to remove a section of the draft.
Sure.
Proposed too, so
Sure.
it doesn't have to go in that
Yeah,
particular order.
whatever motion is
Yeah.
before us, sure.
How many logs can fit on a truckload?
Well, it depends on the size of the logs, and generally it's 5,000 board feet, and that, in the general, what we have now in our urban forest is generally a range of say 12-inch diameters. It'd probably be about 8 or 9 trees, potentially 10 trees, depending. At a
Well,
15
like a
inch
really
diameter.
big one like that one that Greenbrier, that's gotta be,
This big.
that's a big tree.
That could be very close, if not, it's a pretty good sized
So if
tree.
you have enough space to get to a dozen trees, you can't do that without
Forest practice permit.
even this guy who owns a 2.5 acres.
Correct.
I think I'm generally in support, but I am having heartburn over losing the 5 trees in 3 years rule. I think we've seen demonstrated with the map tonight that it could result in loss of tree canopy. And this is unrelated to this conversation, but I think it is related to the context of trees. And I would love to see the foresters really do a study of the tree diseases that are prevalent now, what we see coming as our summers get hotter and drier, and let's assess the impact that could have on our tree canopy, because we can sit here for weeks and years and discuss policy around what we have here, but
Meanwhile,
it could
trees are
all
dying.
get undermined by what's coming at us with tree disease and climate change. So
Okay, well, I think my recommendation is to move forward. If there's a difference in the ordinance at the time that comes from the council, we'll address it as you said. Okay,
Ryan.
okay. And with that, we've reached the end of our agenda. Without objection, I'll call this work session adjourned.
Bye, everyone.
In person.